Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons Sarah Turner and Alexander Lashley. It's Not Just in Your Head is hosted by Psychotherapist Dr. Harriet Fraad, addiction and substance misuse disorder counsellor Ikoi Hero, and myself, editor and producer Liam Tate. This podcast is entirely funded by listeners, and as the famous meme states, we are critiquing capitalism because we are forced to participate in it in order to survive. So, if you can afford to support the podcast, then your contribution will ensure that we can keep making this show. However, if you can't, then please just tell your friends about us, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and follow us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, and YouTube. This week, we're joined by Andrew J. Steir, PhD student in UChicago's Environmental Neuroscientist lab and author of a psych article, Why Life is Faster, but Depression is Lower in Bigger Cities.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
In your article, the psych article, you posed the question, are cities bad for mental health? And the conventional wisdom would be yes, but you sort of show something else entirely. So I just wondered, as a sort of general overview, could you introduce us to sort of your perspective or what you found?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I think rather than, being a totally against conventional wisdom, it's a more reframing of the question. So I think we often think of cities versus not cities. And, depending on where we look in the US or in different countries and what time period, we might get different answers. People are happier in cities, people are happier outside of cities. But the question that we were asking was more about, okay, what about different cities? Why are people in one city happier than people in another city? And basically the short answer, what we found was that the bigger the city is, the less likely people were to be depressed. And the mechanism we propose with the model we have is really that it's about social interactions. People just have so many more interactions in big cities, whether it's, on the subway or, with a barista or whatever you're doing in your daily life, that it's, at least the data are telling us that those are positive interactions. Even if they're shorter or more callous or a little colder, there's so much more of them that it seems to be helpful.
Yeah, I really, really loved what you wrote because it goes back to what we come across all the time, that humans are social animals, that even in an estranging capitalism, our exposure to each other is crucial.
It was interesting to me to kind of, because, it didn't have to be this way, right? I think one of the things, Harriet, I grew up in New York, and, one of the things having friends not from New York come visit is just like how crazy it is, right? And how kind of sometimes almost like superficial some of the interactions could be. So it didn't have to be the case that those were beneficial. I still find it kind of amazing that this even worked out the way it did.
Although I must say that from the people that I know who live in California, they can't get over how New Yorkers can talk about things on a much deeper level instead of just the hiya smile and you never get beyond it. That there's an ability to talk about anything and to talk to anyone. Because in New York, someone's having a conversation, you can butt in if you hear them on the street. And unless you're wearing a urine-soaked sheet or something, you're accepted.
Right. So can I jump on that then? Is there a sort of meaningful difference then? If social interactions are the key to reducing depression, right? Like you had this magical number, right? This 12%. Is that right? Like every time a city doubles in size, was that right?
Yep, we expect about a 12% decrease in the rate.
Right. So is there a certain level of importance then in terms of these social interactions improving sort of quality of life stuff or reducing depression? I guess they're one and the same. Does it matter what those social interactions are? Like you said, Harriet, urine-stained sheet. Like can it be just sort of passing in the street, or is it deeper than that?
I mean, I have my own perspective that I think, of course, it matters. I think, Harriet, you probably have more kind of direct experience of kind of dealing with individuals who are depressed and what their their experiences. But of course it matters, right? It's like, these are like big population average expectations. But for any given person, I can't imagine that the quality of interaction doesn't matter.
Yeah, because it's interesting, right? The conventional wisdom would say that the more rural life, where you have these sort of potentially closer connections with family or friends or whatever, is where you're going to get a certain amount of higher quality, maybe social interactions. So how does that sort of stuff factor in to this sort of body of research or work?
Yeah, so the lesson I think overall from this study was that there's so many more interactions in big cities, as Harriet was just saying. You can have these kind of brief interactions. That was someone that you didn't know very well or at all, really, but it still was an interaction that was positive. And I think that is one thing that we can take away from this, is that on average, these interactions, even if they're not quite as intense as we might get in a more rural area where we know people really well, you know everyone in the town, that they're at least positive on average, right? At least for depression, at least. But this is something that I'm actively trying to do more research on and to understand better, is how does all of this heterogeneity of the quality, and then what type of interactions are they interactions kind of between different neighborhoods, between different groups? How do those factors, as we kind of dig from this big city level down to neighborhoods, buildings, and to individuals, how does that actually factor in and kind of explain the big picture down to the small picture of what's going on? But I don't have a good, clear answer yet.
Well, one of the things I've noticed that I think might contribute somehow, is that I've noticed if you live like in a community like Steir, which has 44,000 people, but it's all together with a big oval in the center where people can sit and talk, and a fountain with benches, or where my daughter used to live in the East Village, a small street, 7th Street, with small brownstones that were tenements and still are, where there's a lot of people sitting on the street. In the summer, they might sit on the sidewalk with a plastic pool for a couple of little kids, and at night they'll sit around and have beers. If you live in that neighborhood, there's a sense that people will look out for you because you're a familiar in the city. And yet, where we go in the country, when I first moved there, I decided I'd get to know my neighbors, and people were so unused to talking. They told me enormous secrets because they don't talk to each other. They really don't. They don't, they meet at the church social or something, but the problems in their lives, the things they grapple with, are not shared.
This sort of zooming out and zooming in stuff, right? So you sent this other paper regarding environmental neuroscience, and pretty interesting, like the scope of it, right? Like that it literally takes this wide view about cities and infrastructure all the way down to brains. So it's kind of extraordinary. I mean, all of that is relevant, but there's this... you mentioned sort of urban scaling theory. I can't remember actually if that was in the paper or the Psych article, but...
So scaling theory in general comes from biology. It kind of was first noticed thinking about metabolism and body size. And so you find that bigger animals have slower metabolisms. They live longer, but they also move slower. They dissipate energy more slowly. And there's kind of fundamental energetic reasons for that, having to do with minimizing energy dissipation. You find similar things in like how big are bacteria, right? There's like a coupling there between the resources available in the environment and kind of the energy efficiency of what's going on. But so those kind of ideas of scaling and this coupling of kind of how big something is to what resources are available, but also then how much it costs to run the thing that you're talking about, came out of biology and came into this urban science perspective in the form of urban scaling theory. So basically the idea is to just starting from very basic ideas of, a city is some space that has people in it and they have to move around, they have to have some sort of incomes, they have to be able to pay for their movement, they have to be able to, get different places in the cities, and kind of from that there you can start to build up these constraints of, okay, you have this many people in a city, how big do we expect it to be? How many, miles of roads do we expect to be on it? How much do we expect people to interact? And so from there, we get these answers about social interaction that seem to be pretty good models. We find that they're pretty well fit to a lot of like mobile phone data, and then on like online social media data. And so, yeah, that's kind of the basis of the paper that the Psych article was based on.
Right. I think there was an analogy or metaphor made there about that it shares similarities with the human body and the sort of vascular system and all that. I thought it was brilliant comparison. And also that this sort of pace of life, intuitive feeling that it's, much faster. And there was it was connected to walking speed. In a more rural area, a town with 10,000 inhabitants, the walking speed was like 3.5 kilometers per hour.
Yeah.
Whereas in a city, it's not quite double that, but it is
about 7. Yeah.
So, I mean, presumably that's happening because people are just running around trying to get to their jobs, right? Like, was there any sort of reason?
Yeah, this is my favorite piece out of all of the urban scaling stuff. I as I mentioned, I grew up in New York, and I think I wrote in the Psych article about this experience of like coming to Chicago for college way back when, and getting off the plane, and I like have to slow myself down to the kind of Chicago Midwest pace. So I love that result out of urban scaling theory. I don't think we know exactly why, but just think stuff's moving faster in bigger cities. And we see it in the walking speed. We see it in kind of how fast people's incomes grow. We see it in kind of the creation of new inventions. If you look at like the combinations of patent codes when new patents are issued in different cities, you see it there. So it's kind of like across the board. It's like just people are going at full tilt in really big cities.
Yeah, a long time ago, Karl Marx wrote about the idiocy of rural life. And that was his
not too
phrase.
Judgmental.
No, not too judgmental. That was a translation of his phrase. And I think you're kind of explaining what happens when you're not talking to people, when you don't connect with people. You may connect more with cows and stuff, but you don't have that automatic acuity of looking around at everything. That's so many things to see and hear around you that everything does slow down and people go inside rather than outside.
I think that's one of the reasons this was surprising as well, is because I think for exactly what you just said, there's so much to look around and to people to talk to, and to the traffic, the lights, everything going on. And I think a lot of early psychologists thinking about cities like that is cognitive overload. This is why people are unhappy in cities. And I think that's part of why it's surprising that with all of that, there's still some psychological benefits to being in a city, which I think many city inhabitants would agree with. Like, yeah, I feel fulfilled. There's a lot for me to do. And that's better than not having anything to do.
Also, big cities are not judgmental. My in-laws, my daughter's in-laws are from rural Mississippi. And one of the things that they can't get over is it's so unjudgmental. Because if you walk around in Sautilla, Mississippi, everybody's looking at you and judging you, or even in Tupelo. But in New York City, you could be anything.
Like, you have this great quote in your Psych article: the character of a city, the collective influence of its inhabitants, hangs in the air, ready to have an effect on whoever is around to breathe it in. And, that feeds exactly to the point you just made, Harriet. But, you also make the point that roads, trains and bus lines, sidewalks and bike paths shape social networks. So, you can see a train of thought, which is that if you have good public transport, frequent, safe, cheap, that might equate to more positive social interactions and therefore, better quality of life. So better infrastructure, you can see potentially having all kinds of benefits for mental health. And like you say, various mental health things actually cost the individual and the state, considerable amounts of money. So it's sort of like a less obvious way of it potentially solving various mental health issues, right?
Yeah, I'd love to be able to say, let's put a new bus line or a new train line in that connects this neighborhood up to the rest of the city better. And, we're going to expect this much decrease in depression in that.
Yeah.
That would be awesome to kind of get to the point where we have enough of the science figured out that we could say that and be confident in that.
Also, I think we should remember that if you're in a rural area, you're always enclosed in glass and metal in your own car. You can't go hardly anywhere without being in this sealed compartment away from other people.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the city, you walk, you take a bus, you take a subway, you take a cab. I was trying to get to some place yesterday and I needed a cab, and another woman was waiting, so we decided we'll share it. And we were both talking about that we're both labor activists in our way and so on and so forth. And then the cabbie chimed in and, about the importance of unions.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so grateful that I'm not riding around in a sealed compartment away from everybody else.
Yeah, I have a lot of fond memories of being in New York City cabs kind of in high school and just having a conversation with the driver. Yeah, those are very fond memories. But so we're looking at some new data now that I think speaks to this. This is preliminary. We're not really done, but what it looks like we're finding is that people who are taking kind of a small number of very long trips, which, we have to guess is the people commuting. And it looks like when we look at where they're going, that it's probably the commuters that are coming from kind of suburbs into downtown areas are much more likely to be depressed. Whereas people who are taking a high number of short trips, even if the total distance they're traveling is the same between the two people, are much less likely to be depressed. And I think, they're probably, those people taking lots of short trips are probably on the train or they're biking or they're walking or they're on the bus. But to your point, they're not, sitting in a car by themselves.
That would be an argument to have something like the French RER, the suburban railroads that come into the central Châtelet stop, because they go to all the suburban towns, which we don't have at all.
I mean, in Chicago, I can't even get to all the Chicago neighborhoods easily, right? We're definitely behind in the US on transportation.
Yeah, public transportation, because what they thought was what's good for GM, said the head of GM, of course, what's good for GM is good for America. So they covered all the tram tracks for the trolleys that connected all the little towns and connected many neighborhoods so that people would buy cars. And now, especially in New York, it's outrageous to have a car because it costs so much.
I noticed in the paper you sent us that there was sort of numerous things sort of talking about how access to green spaces or being around green spaces improved all kinds of markers, right? It lowered crime, it improved people's health and well-being and all that kind of stuff. But I wondered I don't know if those studies sort of, made reference to the fact is that just that the people with the money are hanging out in green spaces anyway? And so they're having a sort of better quality of life, I don't know if you have any sort of experience or opinions or sort of data around the sort of green space thing and class and how those two things might interact.
Yeah, so it's interesting. There was a paper from our lab, I think last year, maybe 2 years ago. It was Chicago, LA, and New York, I think, were the three cities. But basically what they found was that, green spaces tend to be fairly common in use. So there's lots of different people going to them. But people from lower income neighborhoods tend to travel to these green spaces. So for example, in Chicago or in New York, let's say, everyone is going to Central Park rather than using kind of their local parks as intensely. And I think a lot of the times it's because people tend not to feel safe there, or they're not well taken care of. And I don't know how much that carries over outside of the US, but there definitely seems to be this impact of kind of maintenance and, how much are we investing into local green space amenities? They're clearly really important. Even just trees on sidewalks, right? If you go in and ask really kind of underserved communities, do you want more trees on your sidewalks? They're going to say no, right? Even, you tell them how good it is for them and it will make their health better and they'll feel more relaxed and there'll be less crime. They say, no, this is not the most pressing thing. And even if you put the trees here, then you're not going to take care of the sidewalks, and then grandma's going to walk down and, fall and break her hip, right? So there's an interaction there between kind of providing services and kind of trusting public services that I think is important. We haven't really figured out yet how to do that successfully in cities in the US.
In Paris, they certainly do that. All these little parks are beautifully groomed. I think it's just a question of whether only in capitalism, the private sphere is where the money is and the public sphere is where it isn't.
Right.
And so that would be a very different thing. And there's much less socialist and communist influence in the US than there is in, let's say, Paris or Stockholm or, any number of places, Berlin, where they have much better kept little parks where people go and sit and talk and get to know one another. That's a particular feature of US capitalism that the public sphere is denied so vociferously and successfully.
Yeah, it's really a shame. I got a chance to spend a month in Vienna this summer, and there are tons of little parks all over that city that are just packed all the time with everyone. Yeah, and it's wonderful to have that. You can go for lunch and sit in a park, and there's people around. Yeah.
So would environmental neuroscience would it have the power to influence or affect policy then? Like the findings of it? Like, I guess that's one question. And the other question is like, what are either the objective hopes or goals of environmental neuroscience as well? Like, because I assume that it's about understanding certain things and then being able to use those findings in certain ways, right?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question in general of what's the role of scientists in kind of policy. For me, I definitely feel like the responsibility is to kind of present what we know and then leave it to the politicians and public servants to make decisions. I certainly think we'll have a lot of lessons out of environmental neuroscience as kind of a broader field that are certainly applicable towards urban design and maintaining ecosystems in cities and also with outside of cities. It's I think another question entirely of whether presenting state-of-the-art science how that trickles down into actual policy decisions.
Yeah, I was particularly taken by your statements about the effects of pollution, because at least in the US, the neighborhoods that are most polluted are the poorest, because that's where the waste treatment plant is and so on. That's where people are much less mobilized to fight back. How does that affect brains and intelligence and happiness?
Yeah, pollution is terrible. It's really bad. I mean, like you say, there's the waste treatment plants, but there's also, where are the highways, right? I think it's kind of ridiculous that we have highways running through the middle of our cities. But a lot of it, right, is, put a proposal out, we're going to put a highway through this neighborhood. If it's a rich neighborhood, they have the resources and the connections to mobilize and, petition to not have that happen. Whereas the poorer neighborhoods, don't really have those resources to do that. And so that ends up, next to the roads, next to the treatment plants, next to the industrial sites. But there's a lot of literature on this for brain development, and basically it's basically all bad. I think for cognitive function, like working memory and attention, pollution is bad during development and even during adulthood. And then I think particularly with more like chemical pollutants, like industrial products, rather than kind of air pollution, there's been a bunch of associations with intellectual disability and autism. So pollution is terrible for brain development in so many ways.
In that paper, another insight was potentially that not only is it obviously bad to be exposed to pollution, but that besides the positive of being exposed to green space, there's almost like a trick, right? That if the effects can be achieved via interactions with pictures of nature, videos of nature, and exposure to nature sounds, like that's kind of phenomenal that you might get some of the benefits from what is essentially like an artificial version of nature. Now, there was definitely something sort of that popped up in my head at that moment, like a worst case scenario, like, okay, you could take these insights and developers might build a block of housing and then just have some, piece of art that has fractal images or curves. I don't know if you remember that TV program Saved by the Bell, and it had all that sort of 90s triangle and squiggles and stuff like that. And you mentioned that fractal images and curves these things that can trigger this sort of stuff. I was like, oh my God, I can imagine a sort of worst case scenario here when some uses like a crappy aesthetic trick, right? Does that sort of stuff happen, or can you foresee any of this sort of information that you glean through this process being used in sort of worst case scenario ways or best case scenario ways?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it remains to be seen the holistic impacts of that type of naturalistic architecture. But it's definitely really curious. So the things that we've kind of observed the most from showing people images or making them listen to nature sounds is these kind of attentional restoration processes. And the theory there is that, it's like staring at a fire, right? Or staring at, the leaves blowing in the wind. There's this kind of fractal, kind of bottom up. It grabs your attention without you even trying. And that is restorative. And so it lets you kind of reload the directed attention. We're like, okay, I'm going to choose something to focus on. I think we would, how much just, if that's the only effect of kind of the synthetic nature, how that would translate holistically into kind of behavior and health and stuff like that, I think we don't know. But it'd be very interesting to do some more real world experiments with that and see how kind of synthetic natural nature experiences might impact more things outside of attention.
The only thing that gave me pause whilst reading that the paper was just sort of you mentioned the origins of environmental neuroscience has its beginning in early behavioral neuroscience, and I'm sure a lot of science is based off in doing terrible things to animals, but there was stuff in there about rearing rats in darkness and cats in strange visual environments, and basically animals exposed to sort of different physical and social environments during their development, and then seeing what happened to all of them. And the thing that I was like, oh shit, is this about well-being, or could this just be about control? And this is that thing of like intentions versus consequences, right? That could this, the information that you glean through environmental neuroscience be used in less than great ways, right?
Yeah, I think the knowledge, can always be abused, right?
Yeah,
it's a hard question, right? Of what to do about that. I'm not, I think from a science point of view, it's better to pursue knowledge, and generally, for the most part, hope that it's going to be used for improving the world. But once you understand things well enough, I think if someone clever and that intention can come along and abuse it.
Knowledge in itself is how it's applied and interpreted. So I don't think we should ever stop gaining more knowledge out of fear.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. And Bethany Morris had that point, didn't she? Like, knowledge is made to fail, right? That you're supposed to find its problems and then move on to the next thing, right? So I guess my point isn't sort of anti-discovery. It's just sort of what is my point? I think we had a guest on a long time ago, Alfie Bown, and he was talking about video games and programmable desire. And one of the things that came up was that in Victorian times that they were very concerned about how people used their leisure time, right? And that parks were sort of a way of subverting any sort of worker discontent, right? Like if you go for a walk in the park, it was a sort of approved form of leisure, and it also was a sort of way of chilling everyone out. And the thing that I wondered is, because there was a focus maybe on sort of understanding human behavior. We recently did an episode about applied behavioral. Can't remember what it's called, ABA. But you basically, the whole emphasis was born out of behaviorism, right? That you can get compliance out of someone, but you don't necessarily always change their emotional state. And when it comes to infrastructure, it's interesting that you were saying earlier, Harriet, that sort of public sphere has been denied. And I just wonder, like, if infrastructure is one of these things that you can design and you can study and you can quantify and you can then predict how people are going to behave. Yeah, where's the line between sort of well-being versus control? Is there a sort of meaningful difference? And just to sort of try and wrap this up in some sort of cohesive thing, I think it's interesting that, say, the Occupy movement in New York centered around a park, right?
Yeah, Zuccotti Park.
Yeah, it's a public sphere. And it's like, if infrastructure is one of these things that can be considered and quantified, would social spaces be equally quantified as, potentially great because they increase social interaction, but also potentially dangerous because it could be subversive?
Yes, I think that's right. And it also relates to another thing I thought of when you were talking earlier, Andrew, which is that I've noticed that in Connecticut, where I used to live, and in New York, where I grew up and now live again, projects for poor people are always surrounded by highways and often water. And I think that's in case they get out of hand, that you have a chance to put them down and surround them, because it's uncanny how often that repeats itself. And when I lived in New Haven, Connecticut, Yale had a plan to isolate this poor city, because New Haven is a poor city, one of the 4 poorest in the United States, and Yale is the 2nd richest university. They wanted to make ring roads to separate themselves from the people they impoverished with their lower salaries, because they're also the biggest employer. And they wanted to make sure they were safe. And therefore, urban renewal was about keeping them safe and isolated from everybody else. So it had a sort of, in my mind, truly nefarious purpose in the design of the environment.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, especially since, poor neighborhoods aren't like usually in poor, like prime beachfront properties, right? It's a very specific kind of water that
Yes, that's
we're
right.
talking about here. But yeah, I mean, the question of whether something is ultimately to the benefit of the people or, it's used as a system of control is, I mean, I'm not going to say that, that's easy to figure out, but, it's generally like who controls, what happens in those spaces, right? Do the people have a say, or is it severely gate kept? Is it like, does it turn into kind of like a punitive space in some ways? Right. In terms of like, does it end up with a lot of patrol that is maybe excessive, for example? A lot of parks have curfew hours, things like that, and those are kind of indications that it's, there is a control element present a lot more.
One of my favorite other analogies of cities is as social reactors, and too much control, and you're going to shut down the reaction, right? And so I think even things like, I know IBM in a couple of cities has been trying to like do smart infrastructure grids and stuff, and it's generally failed miserably because it's too much control, and it kind of gets rid of that kind of spontaneous, it prevents some of that spontaneous interaction and movement that I think is fundamental of what makes cities kind of good places to be in.
Great point.
I think that your work is enormously important for the left because it says, we look what happens to people and look at how the social enhances life and how our connectedness enhances life and how the places where there's greater diversity enhance life. So that, I think that's a very powerful contributor to a left view of inclusiveness.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot also that's been done by other people about cities and kind of progressive political viewpoints, right? And it makes sense, right? That you interact with so many different people, and so cities tend to be much more progressive in the policies they adopt than broader states or
rural areas.
Yeah, and I thought actually that was illustrated quite well by in the paper. You have this thing, the dyadic problem solving, the pasta and marshmallow experiment. And if I'm reading it right, it was basically sort of diversity of thought equated to a better outcome, right? Than people that were just too similar to each other. So am I reading that right?
Yep.
Right. Yeah. So as far as I understand it, the pasta and marshmallow thing was about who can build the tallest structure, right? With those two pieces of ingredients.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And so it speaks to that idea that I guess always just maybe talking with people that agree with you or share your worldview doesn't necessarily equate to the better world. The better world is actually having sort of more difficult conversations with people, and through that practice, there are sort of better outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of interesting research going on right now in psychology about kind of network structure. So what's the actual structure that people connect with each other and how that influences attitudes. So a lot of this is kind of thinking broadly, but with the idea of thinking about political attitudes and, how do you get to the point where large groups of a network are kind of not even communicating anymore, right? And they're not even willing to be open to information. And you can imagine a world in which we know a lot more about how cities structure kind of local networks, where we can start applying that and seeing, getting a sense of, okay, what parts of cities do we expect people to be more polarized, or we expect there to be more communication, and beyond political stuff. That's just, for like social cohesion, for economic productivity, like that's probably important for all of those things as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's funny that pasta and marshmallow experiment. I came across it before in it might be the book by Daniel Pink called Drive. It might be somewhere else. But the funny observation he'd made is that they gave the pasta and marshmallows to a bunch of like children, and then they gave it to a bunch of like professional sort of, I can't remember what their profession was, but the difference was the kids made a taller structure than the grown-ups. And it's because they prototyped and experimented, and they didn't, whereas all the grown-ups sat around having meetings about it.
I was really taken by your descriptions of how the emotional tenor of a neighborhood and a city is just picked up by the brain. I was thinking, how did we do that? And we do. I mean, I know the difference walking down 14th Street, where people have on blankets, all sort of suspicious looking goods, that they're just trying to sell to get some money. And then walking into Stuyvesant Town, which is it's not a high price, it's sort of a middle price development, but it has all these trees and playgrounds and community sense, and your whole feeling changes. That study of how people pick up the character of a place and its depression level is so important. But I wondered how you measured it.
Yeah, so I agree with you. And one of my favorite things to do when I'm visiting a city for the first time is to just take a full day and just walk through many different neighborhoods. Just, feel that and feel what do different places feel like. It's one of my favorite ways to explore a new city. So, I mean, this is one of the amazing things, I think, is that, we don't actually measure those things, right? We measure the outcomes. So, for example, with the depression, we had surveys of people, and then we also did some machine learning on the language that people were using on Twitter. And since we know where they were tweeting from, we could attribute them to different cities. We can even go down, now we're doing that with neighborhoods. And we don't know that they're picking this up, but we can do it kind of by association, and then we have kind of strong theory to guess that these kind of correlational studies are actually getting at some mechanisms. But it would be, one of the things I've been thinking about recently is whether or not we can use some of these online video games where people are kind of building worlds collaboratively to kind of maybe experiment and try and kind of get more detailed causal information about, how people are actually picking up these features of their environment. Because it could matter, right? And there could be individual differences in that. Some people might be much more sensitive. People might be less sensitive, and that might make a big impact on, even just like individual level treatment programs.
And there is a sort of parallel with video games and architecture in that you explore a kind of built environment, and you have a certain amount of freedom within that built environment, but there are still sort of limits to it. And I guess, that's just sort of coming back to my just being a sort of skeptical, antagonistic dickhead. It was funny because it reminded me a bit of something I'd read about, was it in Paris, Napoleon had decided with, I guess, the other sort of ruling class to gut a certain part of Paris and redesign it in a particular way. And some critics say that part of it was about like getting rid of all of these kind of medieval towns and sort of having these bigger open roads allowed sort of military to come in and crush any uprisings and all that kind of stuff. So again, it's sort of infrastructure as control and all that kind of stuff. And it's just that quote that sort of rang around my head: when you measure, include the measurer, right? So it's like in the attempt to quantify everything, is there something in that speaks to control? Maybe it's a sort of wider point beyond this discussion. I'm not sort of going after you as an individual. It's more just sort of philosophical beard stroking as I was reading this stuff.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if I fully am with you at the philosophical level. I fully understand exactly what you're talking about, but I do think that there's a sense in which what cities do is, and we've been talking about this a lot as like a one-directional, like cities impact people, but it's really this kind of bi-directional process where the timescales are different, right? Me walking around the city is not going to change the roads, but over 20, 30 years, the neighborhood will kind of, or the city itself, people in the city will change the city. So it is kind of a circular process. But what cities do is they structure behavior, right? And we choose that, right? There's a reason we across time, we have some of these quantifications we've done from archaeologists going back to like 1500 BC, where they've kind of done some of these scaling laws by looking at how pottery shards are spread across an area of an ancient city. Create amazing stuff. But humans generally structure themselves into cities in these regular ways. And so we choose and create these structured environments that do control our behavior. And so, I think we get some benefit. Clearly, it's been, as we've talked about, it's been misused in a lot of places, but it seems to be some, as a species, we want some sort of structure like this.
It's a great point. Yeah,
yes.
You make a great point. And I guess just to sort of attempt to be a bit clearer about where I was going with control, I guess, is it's about encouraging what behavior. That's the sort of interesting point. Again, where is the city encouraging individuals to act in a certain way, and is that way actually for the collective betterment, or is it actually just sort of towards, I don't know, maintaining a status quo, for example? Like, I read this amazing article, slight left field, but it was talking about the idea of a sort of psychedelic utopia is incredibly flawed, this idea, because there's all kinds of crazy right-wingers who are all just sort of high as kites, and they use it as a bonding thing, and it can maintain hierarchies and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, in the article, this anthropologist had tracked all these tourists to South America taking ayahuasca, and over a decade, he saw that actually what happened was that these people would say that they have a stronger connection to nature, but actually their behavior, it wouldn't necessarily change. Like maybe as an individual, they felt, I feel at one with nature or whatever, but then they would go back home, still consumed by, I've got a quote here, still consumed by making money, product consumption, emitting a lot of CO2 traveling from France to the Amazon. So, it's possible that, whether it's green spaces or just city infrastructure in general, that, it's all for the purposes of making individuals in a certain way or in a certain mold, right? So, I guess it's about groupthink, right? In what ways, you might be elevated from your depression, but then you are just a dumb, happy consumer, to use a sort of Slavoj Žižek kind of thing. So I don't know if that's any clearer. It was definitely long, so I apologize for the ramble.
It's funny. I one of my favorite things about cities, when cities that work really well, not that many U.S. cities work like this, but it's this weird paradox, right, where they really strongly constrain behavior to the point that we can even do science. Like, I often will tell people in talks, other scientists, that they'll ask about rural areas, and I'll give this retort that they're so idiosyncratic. I don't know how to do science of rural areas, right? It depends on, how far is the church from the grocery store, right? It's something that might be relevant. Or, like how spread out are the houses? They're so idiosyncratic that I don't know how to do science. Cities constrain people strongly, but at the same time, there's so much more diversity of behavior in cities. So it's almost, there's a little bit of a paradox there, right? People's behavior is more constrained, but you get so much more diverse behavior. So I don't know that constraint is actually negative. It might actually, by kind of freeing up movement patterns, allow for freedom of behavior in other ways. But I don't think we really have that nailed down of why that happens.
You can really look at the differences in different neighborhoods in New York City, because partly it's that behavior is more constrained, where in upper class neighborhoods like Park Avenue, there's no mixed usages, there's no life on the city really. Or if you go into the fancier places on Fifth Avenue. Whereas if you go to poorer neighborhoods, people live on the street a whole lot more and they're there. And there's a sense of activity and humanness. I live on the Lower East Side. I certainly get that here. But I also wonder, because some neighborhoods have these enormous high rises in which people are dwarfed and where there's no variety in the buildings, which seems like totalitarian architecture, where there's no curve, there's no variety. Every floor is the same. All the window frames are the same. Whereas if you're in an environment where the buildings have some individuality of expression and curves and lines, you feel more like a human being and much less like a tiny speck. I don't know if that's ever been studied outside of a book by Harris Stone, Memories or Musings of an Unsuccessful Architect, where he writes about that.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Kind of this idea of dense mixed use neighborhoods is on the rise in urban design for sure. Probably is a good idea. I don't think we have extensive scientific backing for it. But it seems to, in the places that it's been implemented, where you have businesses and housing and, tall building and a shorter building and grocery store all mixed in together, and, restaurants on the street and all of that, those neighborhoods seem to be the best, and people seem to be the happiest there.
They're alive.
Yeah. It also reminds me, where you're talking about Jane Jacobs, who's a famous.
Yeah.
So I think she lived in Stuytown as well. And when you read her writings, she talks a lot about the street life on the Lower East Side and how alive it is.
Just the different music you hear walking down the street, whereas in Park Avenue, you don't hear anybody's music.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we have come up to the hour. So, Ikoi, did you have any sort of final thoughts? Or Andrew, I don't know if you want to keep going for another 10 minutes or you want to bail or whatever. But I'm putting it out there. The hour's hit.
I have a little bit of time if we have some more to discuss.
Yeah, Ikoi, if you have any questions or Harriet, any sort of closing
I just wanted to thank you so much, because I never heard of this, and it makes such good sense. The things that make the most sense are often unspoken. And that environmental neuroscience is a field, and it's spoken is a whole world of possibility. I hope our listeners are as excited as I was from reading your article, both the Psych article and the other one. So I wanted to praise you and thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk with you guys about it. And we'll see what the next decades of this research bring.
Yeah, absolutely. It's incredible research, and I think it's important research. I mean, I think this is kind of going to a whole other weeds, so I won't necessarily, I'm not looking for a discussion on it, but whenever, I'm confronted with these issues of society and urban design and more common spaces, I'm living in the times that we're now. I'm wondering how much issues like epidemics and pandemics impact those spaces and how people think about them.
Yeah, that's certainly we could go into a whole nother hour on just that. Yeah.
Right. That's why I was just like, that was a lot of my, just because it's society has kind of polarized into very different behavior sets these days, and I'm not saying one is wrong and the other is right. It's often a difference of various risk assessments, right? But yeah, how these events kind of impact psychology and change people's relationship to spaces has always been fascinating to me. So So again, like I find, all this work just highly fascinating. I'm sorry I didn't have much to say. I was just like listening and nodding my head, and
Yeah, well, you did make the point in the Psych article that the 12% thing, that depression drops by 12%, that it also, because that's to do with social interaction, that also was tracked with COVID as well, right? That transmission increased just as much as that.
Yeah, and I think this point of, not just like the parks and the plazas, but like the transport systems are also civic spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when we forget that, we lose a lot of the like lessons of engagement in kind of civic thought, and what are the important parts of kind of sharing the space that we all inhabit, when we're stuck in our glass and metal boxes driving away. We lose a lot of that experience, and that's probably not amazing as a society.
No.
Yeah, and the guy who runs the Tech Won't Save Us podcast has written a book very much about that, the idea that the electric car isn't going to save us, and pro public transport and all that kind of stuff. So I'll see if I can get him on to sort of follow on from that point, actually, because I think it's a really good point. And yeah, the article is amazing, the insights in that, and then the paper you sent. Can I share that paper with people, or is that something that shouldn't be shared? Or that's okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, that was great.
I just wanted to say one more thing, which is that there's a movie that was done maybe 15, 20 years ago called The Last Picture Show. And it's about a killer who goes to drive-ins where everybody's enclosed in their little automobile and kills them from behind a screen.
Whoa.
And then the confrontation with that person who is the killer. But it's a metaphor really for what happens if people are isolated from one another.
Interesting.
Even if they're next to one another in their cars.
Yeah, and that's actually, there's a whole other thing as well, like particularly in London when you're on the underground, you can be like right in somebody's armpit. So you are physically very close to someone. But if you don't have many friends, or you just don't know that many people in a city, that can be like ultimate torture, right? Because you're very close to all these people, but yeah, you're completely alone. So that can be quite a strange experience.
It is. And yet, I am a very friendly type, and also being a woman, I'm less threatening. But I find if I'm pressed against somebody, I remember being pressed against this tall young man, and I said, look, I'm not trying to cuddle. This is just a subway. And he said, I understand. He gave me a sweet smile, because it was an acknowledgement that we shared. Because if you're that close, anything can be shared if you talk.
Including farts.
Yes, including farts.
All right. I guess I've experienced like the crushing rush hour of like Japanese subways, and it's and it's one of those things where like I think that there's a lot of cultural differences in what gets approved as proper behavior. I think because Japan is such a tight space for centuries, right? We're not a wide open country like the United States is in terms of space. So it's interesting that in those tight quarters that like eye contact and just general conversation is best avoided.
Right. Interesting.
That's a cultural difference.
Right. Well, I mean, you can have conversations, but the more crowded it gets, the more it's disdained. Right? Like during rush hour, when people are really pressed up against each other, it's just like, it's best not to talk,
Amazing. Well, that's a good place any to end it. So, thanks once again, Andrew, for your time and for all your work.
Yes.
I'm looking forward to sort of keeping abreast of all the nature of all of this stuff. It is fascinating.
It is indeed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.
Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons, Alex Placito, Bruce Rogers-Vaughan, Jennifer Cox, Rebecca Johns, Seamus O'Connell, and Sheena Bilmus.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.